Well, all right. Now we can start the conversation. I think this has got the loudest sound. All right, Milton Caniff and Will Eisner in Shop Talk, which is the title of the subject. I want to talk today not so much about broad philosophical conceptions, but rather how we work. You and I, we should take the attitude that we're in a shop with our feet up. We've just washed the brushes
Yes,
and sharpened the pencils, and we're talking. First of all, I'll ask you a question, Milt. And that is, let's start with a very basic concept. We're in agreement that we're dealing with a medium that is irrevocably and interactively composed of words and pictures. Are you in full
Yes.
agreement with me on that?
yes, and you've got to have something to say.
Okay, I'm glad to hear that, 'cause that's the way I feel. What we need to know now is your method of working, your style of working. Now, let me amplify on that. When you start a story, mostly you work in daily strips, in the dailies, is that right?
Well, it works a little differently for me because I've got to tie up my daily strip and the Sunday page.
Are
So
they connected?
They're connected. They read straight through 7 days a week, or they must be readable from Monday to Saturday, or they must be readable from Sunday to Sunday. So the bookkeeping is pretty heavy.
All right.
And the Sunday page, because it's done so much further ahead in time, sets the tone, sets the plot, not just the tone. And I try to find the end of the story first, because that way you've got a goal to work toward. And my approach to the thing, you have a goal to work toward, but also you have, well, you've set yourself a time box. You've got to get things said that lead up to that Sunday page when you come back later. Sunday page 10 weeks ahead, for instance, and daily strips 5 or 6, whichever you can manage. But they still have to match between the last week's Sunday page and next week's Sunday page.
How many weeks does a story run?
Fortunately, I finally decided to stop worrying about that.
Oh,
I used
good.
to go for 2 months, say 10 weeks, and then I realized that sometimes I was chopping it off. If I had a good thing going, it seemed a shame to just chop it off because it was 10 weeks. So I started letting it run its course, and haven't gone beyond 13 or 14 weeks, very rarely, in fact. But I don't feel constrained.
All right. And when I was doing daily strips, it seemed to be almost a requirement of the syndicate salesman.
Yes.
And I think I used to, I suspected later, as I became a little bit more sophisticated, that they felt that they were going to get a cancellation. They could avoid it, or at least break it off at a point where the newspaper would feel that they could cancel. So,
Well, by the way, in that respect, and this is something that's annoyed me over the years, that a newspaper will ask the syndicate to tell them when the story ends so they can cancel.
Yeah.
They don't always say they're going to, but you know when they ask those
that's
questions.
right. That's right.
Now, it always seemed to me the only fair play for them to stop the strip right in the middle of a sequence. So if there's going to be protest, you'll get the protest.
That's right.
Nobody's going to protest after a sequence ends. Why should they?
That's
But
right.
in the middle of it, if they're held and if they're entertained, they'll say, "Where's whoever? You know, what happened to so and so?" And it's only fair to the cartoonist, I think, to give them that kind of break. They never do.
No, well, the whole world of syndicate business, at least I found over the years of syndicate experience I had, is very corrosive in many ways to a cartoonist, because I don't know if you found this experience, but I found that you initially enter the syndicate strip business with a new idea and a fresh approach and a fresh personality. And your strip sells, and it's widely bought. A year or two later, being the great artist you are, or the inventive person you are, you want to add new things and do new things, and then your hand is stayed, because they say, as they told me, well, now, wait a minute, we bought you for this particular strip. We want you to be Will Eisner, or whoever you are. We don't want you to be anybody else.
Yeah.
And suddenly you find yourself at the knobs in a machine, just turning screws.
Yes.
Have you gotten that
Oh,
experience?
yes.
Have you
I
felt
had
that?
it. Fortunately for me, when I stopped doing Terry and the Pirates and started Steve Canyon, I was able to get the kind of contract which gives me the final cut, as they say in the movie business.
Mm-hmm.
So I haven't had that problem as much recently as I used to have with Terry,
Mm-hmm.
and especially with the war going on, because the overtone of propaganda was there and had to be
Mhm.
there and should have been there. But propaganda can be handled in so many ways. It can be cheap and shoddy and offhand, and Jerry come lately, and
Yeah,
Jerry built worse, but properly handled, it can be most persuasive in an emergency time. It's not the kind of yelling fire in a crowded theater that you...
No. I know what you mean, but
Sure.
you're at least talking to people on an intellectual level and presenting a point of view.
Yes, exactly.
It's point of view is in this society is far different, in my opinion, than propaganda.
Oh, yes. Yes, it is.
You know,
indeed.
we can take a point of view. As a matter of fact, by the way, do you know that Mao Zedong used comics widely in his early
I've
days?
seen some drawings.
Little
that
red
were-
books.
were- yeah, well, I have the little red book, of course.
Well, I mean, but they were also red covered as long.
Yes, those were his.
I saw a number of them, and they were very heavy-handed. You know.
Very heavy-handed, although the Chinese generally are very good with graphics. They were just they were falling for their own line,
Yeah.
his line, and of course nobody was going to talk back to the big man. But they had very often the overtone that the boss did it. You know,
Yeah,
the publisher
well, of
wrote
course,
the
it
book.
was the word. Well, let's get back to the business of technique here, or how we work. So you start with the end of the story, so to speak. You know how you want it to end. You know where you want to
Well,
go.
let me interrupt just a moment.
Sure, go ahead.
You set it up and let it be as fragile as it needs to be, because, for instance, in my case, if right in the middle of the story, letters indicate that they know how it's going to come out, and they've outguessed me now, then I still can switch the ending and cross them up,
That's right.
fool them. And it works that way, too. As long as I'm not too deeply into the Sunday series, I can still go do a switch on the end. It makes me look smart as hell, you know.
Well, I think you know. As a matter of fact, I've had that experience. I know others have. Arthur Miller, in an interview some time ago, said that he likes to set up characters and let them go, just
Yes,
and follow them where they go.
Yes, exactly.
And I think that to me is, in Life on Another Planet, it was another novel I did. I found that was the best way to create a situation, know where they're going to go ultimately, but set them up first
Yes.
and follow them rather
And-
than direct them.
Throw up all the red herrings and
That's right.
everything else
And
is
so-
necessary.
Well, now, since we're talking about a continuing set of characters like Steve and Steve Canyon and the characters surrounding it, your plots do take on a kind of similarity, do they not, or are they violently different?
No, the plot structure is similar enough, but you can change the pace as much or as little as you choose. For instance, essentially my kind of thing is hang them on the cliff and get them off the cliff, or
Mhm.
boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl thesis.
mhm.
The most fundamental is not only the soundest, but the most endlessly used, of course.
Mhm.
And this could be true whether it's a love story or not. It's still true.
So do I understand that to mean that you superimpose a problem over a basic fundamental boy meets girl story?
Yes, to give you a for instance, this is
Yeah,
something I'm
that's what I'm
currently
looking for.
into right now. Maybe I should go back to, I had a character named Raven Sherman when I was doing Terry and the Pirates, who began as a very austere teacher, a missionary type teacher, but a lay teacher. And she was hair pulled back, starched, proper, Catherine Hepburn, an African queen in the beginning, when she was one person, and when it ended, she was another. And the total result of this is that the basic structure was that she was like this, then she was doubtful, then she capitulated to the guy, and then in the end went back to being herself again, you assumed. And now, this gives you an opportunity to switch that ending and make her not what you assumed.
Mhm.
The simple time gives you that privilege. And sometimes when you start, you think you know the ending and you've established an ending, but it's very comfortable, or can be made so to just switch and fool the reader, because I think it is true that readers like to be fooled.
Well, the readers love surprise. They also they don't want to be disappointed, but they want to be surprised.
It isn't just the whodunit kind
Uh-huh.
of murder mystery.
Well, let me, in that frame, ask you about something that has troubled me professionally all the years, but you have always seemed to have had really seemingly no trouble with it. A daily strip, to me, is like trying to conduct an orchestra in a telephone booth. I've always seemed to wind up choked up because I have so much to say in that one strip.
Yes.
And I'll either go the other way and say nothing, which is disastrous and stupid, or say too much, which is equally stupid. Have you ever felt the daily strip closing in on you as a form, and how do you deal with it? I think what we're trying to find out is something that a student of the art form can learn from.
Well, when I first started, I'd been doing a daily strip for the Associated Press called Dickie Dare, which had no Sunday page, so I didn't have to worry about that. It was just jumped from Friday till Monday, and that was that. But once into this Sunday page thing, which had to mesh, I was facing a problem, and Molly Slott, who at that time was head of the Chicago Tribune Syndicate, Tribune News Syndicate, she said, "Why don't you ask some of the old boys who've been at it a while and see what they do?" So I wouldn't have dreamed of asking Harold Gray or well, even Chester Gould was not all that new. He'd been around for a couple of years at this point. But anyhow, I wrote a letter to Harold Gray, and waiting for the blow to fall of no answer or a negative answer or nasty something. Instead, I got a 4-page single-spaced typewritten letter from Harold saying about various things, but about this in particular. On a Monday morning, any given Monday morning, I do at least I have to use one panel to recapitulate the weekend thing, which has been a whole big Sunday page, and then another to conjecture on what I might be able to do with whatever the dilemma is. And then the last panel, you advance the strip. In other words, you use something that you had not used in the Sunday page. Maybe the first two incidents, which you view from a different point of view. There's a fight in the Sunday page, for instance. You see that fight. On Monday, two guys will say, "Hey, did you see those two guys fighting over there?" Well, you've told exactly the same story over again from another point of view, and a perfectly legitimate thing. Then his gimmick was that in the last panel, you have the door open, then comes the man with the gun. Then you're into Tuesday. You're off and running.
Well, how much story did he say that leaves you? It leaves you one panel to develop your plot?
Again, it's more a matter of what your plot is going to be. In other words, the Raymond Chandler thing of the door opens and there's a man with a gun. That's all you need to start a mystery story, any mystery story. Well, in effect, that's what he was doing here. That one panel is enough to suck you into tomorrow. Then tomorrow's all going to be new gravy. Now, you may have needed that opening panel to just bring you up to date. You may have needed the second panel because you missed yesterday's Sunday paper. But surely you need that last panel because you don't know what's going on out there in the hall or what's going to happen when the door opens and admits the man with the gun, or figuratively speaking, a man with the gun. That panel, in his view, was enough to hold the audience and advance the story. Then on Tuesday, you can jump and run any way you want to, assuming that the reader's with you.
Well, you work in that frame then. I mean, you
essentially I still do it.
Still do that.
Years ago.
Well, do I understand, Milt, that you have a total view of the story? Let's just fabricate a plot from the man with the gun who enters the room, in that you know that for the next 2 weeks you're going to have a running account of a man who is behind the door with the gun, and he's a hitman from Chicago, let's say, and he's here to kill this guy who turns out to be a sleuth himself. And through some mistaken identity, they think the guy from Chicago thinks he's another Hood. Okay, that's the essential theme of that plot. Now, that particular idea, how many weeks or how many days do you deal with something as explanatory as that?
The exposition is really not very necessary when you're showing this, again, graphic thing of a man with a gun. That's enough. He doesn't say he has a gun. He's got a gun.
That's right.
Maybe a phony, but he's got a gun. You think he has. And you can make it turn any way you want. This is where I jump to the end of the story and make everything that happens after that incident of the opening, make everything that happens, whatever path it takes, lead to that culmination.
Culmination.
And which may mean that the end of characters, it's awful to to kill off bad guys because you need them. You get a really good reader. You know, Chet Gould never does, or if he does, the death is so questionable that you have to go
You
to
can
the
always
coroner's
bring him
office.
back.
So you bring back prune face.
Well, I have problems with villains myself. All my life, in all the years that I've worked, I've never been able to see a villain as an absolutely true villain. Always, in the back of my mind, say, well, I'll bet he's good to his mother.
Well, I think your self-criticism is sound, and I don't know exactly how to categorize it, because when something is unfinished, it's unfinished. You've got to go on to pick up the storyline,
Yeah.
and so forth. But the reader gets very clever. Some of these readers get they'll do anything to keep from being made fools of themselves. You know, they'll talk about their favorite thing.
Well, let's go on. So now we have a fair concept of what you do for a story. By the way, when you have a story idea for your next 10 or 15 weeks, do you sit down and rough it out? What's the mechanics? What's the procedure you use?
As I go along in a given story, beginning with some time before the story begins, I start stockpiling places and events, or cross-reference events, or referrals, something that actually happened. So when I come along, naturally I'm going to be dealing in fictitious characters or fictional. But I want to have done a little homework between just sometimes me and the ceiling. I think this gal would be vulnerable to soft music, or I think she'd go out of her mind if she were invaluable. She wants to be free.
Excuse me, sir. Yes. This is for you direct. Yeah, but before you do the union and war, everything for you.
Okay. I'll go there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
I want to stop in a second.
Yeah. This is supposed to be recording now. I say this is supposed to be recording. We'll see whether we have something here. Hopefully, if I haven't pulled out a plug. Let's see now. All right, why don't you say something, Milt, just to...
All right, get a level.
Yeah, just so I can see how far away you are, so we don't have to shout at each
I
other.
just
all right?
talked to the guy in California where it was 70 degrees.
Oh, that's a horrible thought. I'm sorry you said that. It's ruined my whole day. There we go. All right. We're recording once again, let's hope. All right, let's go back and talk about your actual technique. We were talking the other day about pen and ink and style. Just to make it fast and easy, why don't you go through the current procedure? From story, you write the story.
Yes. The way I'm working now, unlike the old days when I used to letter in pencil right on the drawing paper, I take ordinary foolscap and lay it out as if it were strips, 2 to a page of foolscap, and divide that into panels of 3 each, and start writing it then exactly the same way, except roughly this time, because I'm going to dictate this over the telephone to Shell Dorff in San Diego. And in doing so, I've got to be able to change pace in the middle of it if I want to. If I realize that I've said something I didn't want to say or want to add a word, I can just make a note of it myself as I go along, and he only gets what I want him to hear. And he takes it down in a kind of comic strip shorthand. And he's a very fast lettering man. In other words, I can dictate this to him as I did just yesterday, 6 strips and a Sunday page, and he will have it lettered in the mail that same afternoon by Air Express, so that it'll be back here the following morning.
Now you get it back with the balloons on the board, on the Strathmore or whatever board you use.
He just ruled it up so that you can anticipate what I want. Sometimes I want a single panel with no smaller panels at all, just one great big panel, as on New Year's Day, Christmas Day, or something else. And when he letters left-handed, by the way, which I don't see how he does.
Well, you draw left-handed, don't you?
And my lettering is terrible, as most left-handed people's lettering is.
That's right.
Yet there are many left-handed people in this business. George Wonder was left-handed.
Oh, I didn't know.
Bill Mauldin was left-handed.
Yeah.
And good lettering men, too.
Michelangelo was
Yeah,
left-handed.
of course. But the having to push the pen in lettering has always been a problem. Even back in high school, in mechanical drawing class, it was a real handicap to me. And as a result, I've always been a little gun shy of lettering. I can do it. I just don't want to do it. I just hate to do it. Did it for a long time until I could afford it. Lettering.
Well, join the club. I think most of us hate lettering.
Yeah, I guess so. But in any case, I can always do it. I can always fake it if I have to. And sometimes I do. For instance, when it comes back from Shell, I send it right on because I've done whatever notes I'm going to make. Sometimes it's just a word background, storm at sea, for instance. That's all I have to tell Dick Rockwell, who then really lays out the strip in tight pencil. Then it comes back to me and I finish it, and I'm the last one to see it, the final cut. So. And the interim time, I can change it around if I don't like the way Dick has penciled something or I want to change it. I never dislike what he pencils because he's very good. It's just that I change my mind sometimes.
Dick Rockwell, is that his name? Is he related to Norman?
He's not Norman's nephew. Yeah.
Oh, all right.
His father was Norman's brother, Jarvis Rockwell.
Ah, I see.
Also an artist, by the way, a designer, I should say. He designed children's toys.
That's interesting. Yeah.
And so Dick grew up almost in the shadow of Norman, which is unfortunate in that people always equate him with Norman. And he's very good on his own, but he doesn't paint the way Norman Rockwell did or anything else. He's his own man.
How long has Dick Rockwell been working on your stuff?
20 years now.
On your work?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't know as long as that.
Just after the war. He was a pilot in the war, and when he came back, was freelancing, doing comic books and that kind of thing. And he lived down the road from me in Rockland County.
Uh-huh.
So came by one time. I had just met him before. Came by and brought some samples and said that the comic book business was a comic book business, and he was too busy one week and not busy at all the next, and if I had anything that I needed done, that he would be available probably. So I asked him to do a couple of sample things, just cold turkey, and he did. They were very good. He was a little nervous about it at the time. He had no reason to be, but he'd just never done a newspaper-type strip. He'd never done it in strip form, for instance. Mm-hmm. Always in page form.
Individual paint, yeah.
Well, I needed that too, of course, but...
Yeah. So interrupt you, he pencils tightly then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Reasonably tightly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then you get it.
My pencil of a situation, for instance, which I can't describe in one sentence, and handwritten or lettered, is too loose. What I need is what he supplies, not what I supply. I've always been a very sloppy penciler, and only in very tight facial situations and so on have I penciled this tightly. I actually almost pencil it with a brush, you know.
Well,
with a pen.
I understand. There's an advantage to it because you know what you're doing and you get a freedom of flow of movement. When it's very tight, you're tracing rather than drawing.
That's exactly it. And sometimes I want to intensify a situation where I'll have the guy is running down the road, for instance, to escape from bad guys. And Dick will do it very correctly and very well. But I want to intensify it. I want to make him look more scared, so I'll bend him over more and put him in a position of an intense effort instead of just a jogging kind of scene. And it means actually...
Well, then actually Dick Rockwell will compose the panels too.
Yeah.
And you'll get back something which you can alter if you wish. Isn't that what you're saying?
That's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
I don't have to do it very often because he's so good, and especially after this many years.
Sure, yes.
But every now and then there'll be something that I had in mind to be more something else than what he does. And just a simple matter of changing it. And by the way, every once in a while, quite deliberately, not just to pick up time, although it helps that too, schedule time, is that I'll just block out a Sunday page or a whole set of strips and do them all myself. It's like a hostess should always sleep in her guest room once in a while.
Yeah. Or you can't keep your hand out of the soup, so to speak.
Well, also, you don't want to lose your touch either.
I think that's very important. I agree with you.
And doing it from cold scratch is the only way to find out.
Yes.
It isn't a matter of picking an easy one.
Well, let me interrupt here because this brings up something I've been wanting to ask you. I spent a lot of time in recent years, and I use myself here because it's the only comparison I have, I find myself more and more concerned about composing a panel. That is staging. I know you and I have talked about our theatrical background. I was hardly theatrical, but I'm interested in the theater.
Sure.
And I mentioned to you about my early life with my father doing back sets and you stage sets, and you were, of course, involved in college theatrical and amateur theater. I think professional for a while too, weren't you?
Oh, just as I could grab a job as a super in college or in high school.
Well, anyway, what I'm trying to get at is that I regard the panel as a stage.
So do I.
And I move my, I spend a lot of time arranging where my characters come in and go out and what's important, and I compose a panel. Now, do you feel the same way? Do you do the same thing?
Definitely. And also, we're saddled with one problem. I don't know whether you have to do this or not, but in the rescaling, that is the paste-ups of, I draw for third page size because that's the greatest number of clients, customers I have.
Yeah.
Third page, Sunday, that is. But about 3 inches from the bottom, I always have to pencil the lines, about 2.5 inches actually, which means that this is where they're going to cut it off for tabloid size, and that 1/2 of standard page, 1/4 size, real postage stamp stuff, which is annoying as hell.
I know, it's terrible.
But still, you can't put anything below that line that's of any importance to the plot. However, for composition, I very often will add a whole thing down there, which I know is going to be cut off and thrown away in a lot of papers, but still, I can't stand seeing it just sloughed off.
Well, Milt, does that mean that you're laying out or you're composing each of those panels as much for the purposes of newspaper, that's clarity and
Yes.
the fact that it's coming down to a postage stamp, as it is for storytelling? I
Yes,
you
have to think
that is a
all the
consideration.
time,
Yeah.
every day, every minute of every day.
Let's get into the pen and ink you mentioned earlier. I know a lot of students always ask me, what pen do you use? Matter of fact, I recall that when I first got out of high school, while in high school, I went down to the New York American looking for a job, and I went into the bullpen there, and it was the first question I asked the artist there, what pen do you use? Somehow thinking mystically that, that I get the same pen, I'll draw like him.
Well, there's one thing about it on the negative side, that if you want to draw a given way, if you like the line work that James Montgomery Flagg did, for
Yeah,
instance,
yeah,
it's
yeah.
a good idea to use his pen. And then maybe that's not for you. I found this out. I'm sure you did too. I was using a 290 or something like that, and I found that the Croquill, Gillott's Croquill 659 was a better pen for me because it was stronger. It was not quite as resilient. It wasn't
Soft.
soft.
Yeah, I started out with a 290, and it's a very soft pen.
I still don't know what James Montgomery Flagg used.
I think he used that.
He probably did, because you couldn't get lines like that unless
No,
you
I
did.
think he did, and I think Gibson before him.
Yeah, Earl Flagg.
They used a soft.
He was always saddled with that Gibson thing. You know?
Well, they literally painted with those
Oh,
lines.
yes,
You
yeah.
know, it seemed to me like they were just prongs on a brush, so to speak.
What amazed me always, and still does, is how they could hold that much ink that long.
Yes.
Some of those lines are just halfway down the page. A girl's hair, which is Gibson would draw, curling down below her face.
That's right.
And it seemed like one continuous line.
And there were no going over those lines, because I've seen those originals. You just didn't go over those lines. You just snapped them in.
And no white, as I remember. I don't remember seeing...
No, that's right.
white.
That's right. They used a razor blade. I remember talking about my first job up at the New York American on newspaper. This old guy with a green visor and sitting next to me, and I said, "Well, what are the tools here?" And he said, "Kid, old grizzled old newspaper man as you and I have known them."
Yeah.
And he picked up an old razor blade and a kneaded eraser. And he said, and the pen, he said, "These are all the tools you ever need, kid." He'd work on a hard surface, on a plate finish paper, and they'd razor blade off. Well, you use a pen to outline the figures, do you? The
No,
heads?
not entirely. It depends on the time element, for one thing. If I'm lush with time, which is rare, I'll draw out a whole scene. But usually I have to take a brush full of ink and throw in the blacks, shadow side of the picture, whatever the incidents.
Yeah.
Whether it's a person, daylight, it's a little tougher. At night, you can use those wonderful the things that you do with street lamps over people's heads.
Yeah.
Show their feet by the shadows of the legs against the light of the street lamp on the cobblestones.
Well, that's my city drawing. But you handle shadows beautifully as storytelling devices.
Yes, very often they are really the point of the thing. And I've got one, for instance, to give you for instance, and which takes place at night on a beach in a Caribbean island, and you see silhouettes of people, including the hero, who is sort of tailgating this woman. They think she's going to be mugged, and the muggers come out of the bushes. All this is in silhouette. She's the one with the awful face.
What you currently do.
And the two muggers approach her from the rear, and then just at the moment when they're about to pounce on her, she hears them coming, of course. We know that. And she has a flashlight in her hand, and she just flashes the light on her face. You don't see her face, but they do, and they run into the
Oh, that's great. I love that device. I think that's fabulous.
It's all shadows,
Oh,
except
that's classic.
you see the edges of the light
That's
around her
classic.
hand, and you're looking right into the flashlight.
Oh, I think, yeah.
The bare bulb of the
And then you
flashlight.
see the face of these two characters. This is in
No, they just run. You see them across
are
the
these
sand.
recent Steve Canyon
This
sequences?
is one I just did.
Current
last
Steve
week.
Canyon. Oh, that's great.
It runs
That's
in
marvelous.
March or something.
Oh,
But
I
late
think
March.
that's great. That's
Anyhow,
really great.
to play up the fact that she has this horrible face, which nobody ever sees except the character. They all say, "Oh, that horrible face," but you don't know why it's horrible.
Well, they use blacks as a storytelling thing. Now, I recall one of my favorite handlings of black, which I really watch. You know, I must tell you that when you were doing Terry, for the difference in our age, man, I was in high school for a while you were.
Oh, yes,
You were out there in the major leagues. You were one of the major leagues, and I was looking at a lot of the Terry. My God, you know, I'm beginning to sound like one of the kids that come, saying to me, when I was 3 years old, you were a great cartoonist, and I want to beat the kid over the head. No. Please don't accept this as adulation, Milton.
I understand perfectly. I got it.
I'm going to be thrown out of this place. What I want to say is that you've used blacks in snow scenes where you drop the black.
He really can. Stole that from Roy Crane, of course.
Did you?
Oh, he was the best.
Did he do some? I
This
didn't
kind of
know.
thing. He had a sequence once in the Alps, and the foreground people are all cartoony as the Dickens, the way he could draw cartoons, the wash tubs.
Mm-hmm.
Here. But the backgrounds of those mountains in the Alps were just magnificent.
Oh,
I don't think anybody's ever done that in this world.
I didn't remember. I thought you originated. Well,
Well,
okay.
what happens is you take it on from there.
Yeah, well, of course.
He didn't do it as, when he did it, it was really almost decorative. When I do it very often, it's very practical application.
Well, that's why I said you do as a story. Just as I see a great difference between your work and Sickles, and yet you will constantly say, well, Sickles did it first. Well, actually, I see it. I, as a professional, see it differently. I see different values in it, just as I recognize different styles in anybody else. At any rate, the board itself, it's roundabout way. We're getting back to the board itself, the actual finished board. So you use a pen and ink to outline the faces or the heads.
Outline the light side of the thing.
I see. It'll go all the way down the figure with that pen, then.
Well, you can if the circumstances call for it. The close-up drawing, of course, I use a pen almost without exception. Then come back in with a brush and do hair, especially. Blonde hair is hard to do simply because if you get too fine lines, it'll fade out in some papers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And with a brunette, of course, it's much simpler to make the point with highlights. I have a tousled-haired girl, for instance, who's in a sequence that I just finished. And it was fairly easy to just slop in there with a brush and show just highlights on her bouncy hair. Then the next woman character is blonde with very fixed beauty salon type set hair where everything is exactly so. And the danger there is using a brush and getting it too thin, so you'll often use a pen
to hold
just
the line.
to hold the line strong enough to reproduce in Sheboygan,
Well, I've gone back to pen for backgrounds now, and I use a hard quill, that is an
Mm-hmm.
unresilient quill for backgrounds. I've suddenly rediscovered it again, and I'm really enjoying it. I still love a brush for figures, and I will use a brush for figures wherever I can.
Well, nobody does better than you, by the way, because I was following your very first that Philadelphia Enquirer bulletin,
Yeah.
whatever it was. The first time I saw your
Bulletin.
stuff, and it was really a
Well,
bonus.
That's nice to hear your memory's so good.
Oh, my young friend in Bryn Mawr that I told you about, the one who made book on the
Those
thing, week to
stories.
week.
Well, it was a
She's the one who
novelty.
sent it on to me.
Well, it was a novelty when you think about it. It was the first comic strip that was doing complete stories
Mhm.
every week.
Oh,
No one
yeah.
had ever done that before,
These
strangely
kids out
enough.
there ate it up, by the way. We talked about this before, about how amused I've always been, and you have too, about ruining these kids' lives. And here are these college kids
Yeah.
feeding with a spoon, you know,
Well,
and going down and stealing proofs at the bulletin.
I never knew that, but I wish the hell I knew it then. I'd have demanded more attention from the syndicate. Well, let's get
By the way, who was syndicating you at that time?
Register and Tribune.
That was Register and
Yeah,
Tribune.
that was Henry Martin then, and
Yeah.
then later on Bruce Horton.
Mhm.
And
I'd
then
forgotten.
yeah, and then they ultimately well, they were the syndicate of record all the way until
Mhm.
until 1951, 52 when I dropped it.
Mhm.
No, the reason that was for me. I hadn't. It wasn't my idea to do a complete story. It was their idea to have, but no one had done it before. That
Yeah.
gave me the historical advantage just
Oh, and
purely
that-
by accident. I mean,
I think that's one of the things the kids
I've never-
liked, especially
I've never
because
planned it.
when they were following my kind of scripts, and they'd lose a day or two during the week, and they'd lose the thread. You know?
Well, that's the reason I questioned you so closely about how you conduct a story, because I still can't conceive in my mind that if you have the panel 1 for a recap and panel 3 or 4 is the cliffhanger, then you've got 2 panels, and it seems to me, my God, how can I tell a story in 10 weeks or even 12 weeks in 2 panels a day? It just really is it seems horrible to me. I move, well, it's a totally different medium.
Yeah.
Complete 7-page story versus,
I did, well, in the early days when they didn't go for the reprint comic book, we'd sort of run the course there, and I wrote some original comic book pages or stories, complete book.
Well, did you? When was this?
This was around
Approximately.
the 50s, I suppose.
Oh,
It had to
yeah.
be that far back.
Yeah.
Because we'd run through the reprints on the early Canyons, and the kids weren't buying them as avidly as they thought they should. So we tried the original story thing, and it worked. All of a sudden, they didn't know how the story came out. They hadn't read it in the newspaper.
That's a good idea.
And this was the reason for switching, but somebody had to write this.
So you had your teeth into some complete story all
In
at
the
once.
beginning, I did it myself, but it got to be just too much work, and I had to delegate it then. But at least I learned how to do it. I learned the technique.
Did you find it was very different from the
Oh
daily
yeah,
strip?
quite different. You stall at different places for one thing. In the dailies, when you're doing it day by day, you've got Cap describe it, I think, best. That he would take
That's Al Cap, yeah.
Al Cap,
Okay,
yeah. The beginning and the ending of a story, and then put a string between them and hang bubbles of incident on the string.
Oh, that's very well put. That was Al. He could say things
Yes.
like that. It's very, 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 very apt.
I
Very
think one
put.
of the things that he failed to do, though, was to build his climaxes as effectively as he should have. He'd get bored with the story. He'd enjoy it the first few weeks, and then he'd get bored and let it
Yeah.
peter out.
Yeah.
Not always, of course. I mean, he was
Yeah,
a master
no.
of the other thing. We talked about having this girl with a Veronica Lake hairdo and beautiful body
Yeah,
and
yeah.
an awful face.
Yeah.
And but everybody in the Yoakum family thought she was great. And it had nothing wrong with her face. Everybody else said, oh, but not the Yoakum family. And they built this and built this, so that when she turned around, she had the face of Mammy Yoakum. Of course, they didn't hate that face. They loved that face.
Sure.
Well, this is great. This is when you
Yeah.
do something like that.
Well, I think Al had a devilish streak in that he loved the shock.
Yes. you did.
I think more than even you and I do, or anybody else I know. Even in your work, I don't see a desire for sense of shock more than I a sense of desire of romance and atmosphere and
Yes,
story. I think you seem to tend to it. I think each of us takes a different approach. But Cap, I can just hear him roaring with laughter, just sitting back in that big leonine head, go back and laugh
Yes.
out loud at one of his own stuff. 'Cause
Oh, yes.
every time he talked with me, when I knew him, if he told me something funny, he was the first guy to laugh.
You start to laugh before you talk.
Yeah,
I never thought of it.
yeah.
He did that in his broadcasting, too.
Yeah. Well, let's get back to, so we can finish this off, was at the page itself. Now, Rockwell has penciled it, you've inked it, and now what does it look like when it's finished? Do you, is it a very clean and pristine page, or is it?
I use a lot of detail, of course, so that it's a busy, almost without exception, a busy page, but it looks good to me if the drawing feels good. I had a high school art teacher who said this is a very simple business. He said, if it looks good, let it lie. If it looks wrong, change it. And that's all you have to know.
I had an anatomy teacher who told me once, don't worry about where the bones are. If it looks good, it's right.
Exactly so. She's the same teacher, I told you, would hold up a drawing of mine long after I was out of high school to see how much I had erased. If I hadn't erased enough, and I had tried and failed and tried and failed, she didn't think that I had worked hard enough.
That's an interesting point.
If I had been someone who traced and then did my erasing on the tracing paper, then, but she knew how it worked. She knew that I would.
That brings up an interesting question. I interrupt that thread, but there are artists who sit down and they start drawing. They'll draw the top of the head, down the side of the nose, and the pencil will go down right along. You know what I mean? They
Sickles works that way.
Yeah. Now, another artists are busy running. Their pencils are flow. I'm talking about the penciling. I do a lot of constructing. My pencil's like a dancer. It just keeps moving around and flowing. I do a lot of feeling in construction. How about you?
Well, I first of all use the same old C.N. Landon's thing of the head and the stick body to get action, or even the simplest action.
Very good.
The guy just putting his arm around a girl, for instance. Have the hand come out where it should, not have too long an arm, or too short an arm, or whatever. And but especially on the action type stuff. And then just flesh it out. But I work all over the canvas. I had a painting instructor in art school who said, work all over the canvas. Don't pick at an eye or an ear or something. Get laid out first before you go back.
So that's what you do. You work. Do you work with the pencil with a hard pencil or your soft pencil?
2H, 3H.
2H.
2H is my favorite. Sometimes if I'm in a big hurry to get some effect or I'm playing, I'll use a soft pencil. And then it's a mess and it's hard to erase and so on.
Yeah. You work on the plate finish paper or kid finish?
No, it's kid finish.
Kid finish paper.
3-ply, kid finish. I've used the same paper since I was in high school. Strathmore 3-ply paper. I tried everything else, of course, to find out whether it would work. And that was my bag.
Well, the only originals I've seen of yours looked awfully clean, but somebody the other day told me they saw some of your work and had a lot of white paint on it.
Yes, I've used a lot more white paint.
Yeah.
I used to never use white paint in the first place, not because I didn't need it, but because the retouch white that they had in those days was not good enough.
Yeah,
You couldn't work over it. It chip and mush up, and anybody dropped a tear on it, you'd have muck. But in more recent times, I found two reasons. One, for speed, and secondly, certain effects that I want to get, I could only get with white. And speed is the main reason. I'll go through a whole set of strips, for instance, and just make a check mark above the head of a character that I want to change in some way. And then I've forgotten what it was I wanted to change. I go back, and I only have to think a minute or two to think, the face is too long or too short or too wide. Just one stroke of white down the edges of it, and it'll be more of what I want. And I'm always fighting the clock, always have been, but even more so now. In recent time, I've slowed up. That's what it comes down to.
Well, I don't know whether we slow up. I think what we do is I find myself being dissatisfied with the first effort.
Well,
whereas before I was always satisfied with the first shot.
That's true, too. But I used to work, for instance, consecutively through, just straight through, stay with it, stay with it, stay with it. And my doctor finally told me that two things that my circulation is so lousy that you've got to get up and move around and take a break every 10 minutes, a break at least every hour. The old arm and also, if you begin to feel eye weary, don't push it. go lie down, take a nap, or do something else. Go look out the window. And this I've had to do, and now I welcome it because it does make a difference.
Yeah.
I can go through a whole night like that by knocking off a half hour somewhere along the line, take a nap, drink some coffee. I drink coffee all the time, but do something else.
Were you always a disciplined worker, Milt? We can continue our conversation, but essentially, that's, as I said, the purpose of this this series is to kind of put down for posterity. It's a little presumptuous, but this kind of shop talk, which I don't think exists anymore. And I notice a lot of the kids, the young people, are so widely separated. Very few of them. Husband together, huddled together is a word that we used to do, all in one sitting where we could go down to a bar and have good, real, solid talk. I learned a lot just talking,
Yes, of course you do.
comparing.
You find out things about the business that way.
That's right. Put that there, and we're walking. Well, as I was going to say, that I remember an incident in my own studio with Lou Fine, whom you may or may not know of. I started out using Japanese brushes because they were cheap. They were 3-4 cents at the time, and I was terribly interested in the Japanese art. I always thought when I started out in school that it had a relationship to modern comic art. And one day, all the guys gathered around. There were 5 or 6 of us in the studio, and we had a contest. It was like 2 bullies doing hand wrestling, and we drew. One would start off with a line, and the idea was the other fellow would go back over that line with the Japanese without appreciably thickening it. We'd go on like that. Of course, the winner, the loser who wavered would buy beers. So it's that kind of. I know, of course, long conversations. You worked alone for the most part, or with this?
When the chronology of it is simply this. Of course, I worked in newspaper art departments until I was fired at the Columbus Dispatch in the Depression, and very lucky to get a job here at the AP Feature Service. A month later, I was only out of for a month. Had to borrow money to get to New York, but that's par for the course. However, I had a job. That was the important thing. I wasn't coming in cold. So I was in what used to be called the Fraternity Club. It's now called the Hotel something or other, 38th Street in Madison. And the one-room cell, Allerton House kind of hotel room. And I was settling down there to do whatever I had to do at night. Meanwhile, I'd checked in at the art department, the AP, which is a bullpen, a very good one, because they brought guys in from outside like me for too little money, not knowing how much it cost to live here. And that included cap. And
how did they discover you? How did you get?
The bureau managers of the AP have a secondary function, which is to forward to their main office any work by an outstanding writer, or in those days artist. They don't do this any longer. And this was just part of his assignment.
I see.
A man named Brophy, who was head of the bureau, AP bureau, which was in the Columbus Dispatch building.
I see.
And he was moved on to Chicago as bureau chief out there. But all the time he'd been sending back clippings of my stuff back to the art editor here, feature service editor. His name at that time was Brooks, a man named Brooks. And when they had an opening coming up in their bullpen, then I got a query from Wilson Hicks, who was the assistant, and then became head of the art department. I shouldn't say art department because he was head of the feature service, and had writers and artists and photographers.
Well, anyway, that got you to New York. I just wanted to...
Very often it's somebody who is following your work that you don't even know exists, who gives you this break, pushes you on, or refers you to someone, or tells someone that you're good out there in wherever, and they ask to look at your work. And fortunately, samples are so important in this kind of thing. I had a good batch of samples already there without any effort on my part. I also had a good batch that had been turned out by everybody else. The only place I didn't apply for a job was the AP. I didn't even know they had an art department. I tried United Features and King Features and all the others. Got a polite turn down from all of them.
There you are in New York.
All of a
from
sudden
Ohio.
you're in New York now. You were asking about, do you work alone? during the day. Then I worked at the AP in the bullpen, straight away general assignments. I think we talked about it before. The first job was crossword puzzles. The new guy always had to fill in the blanks of the crossword puzzle. And you make one mistake and you got every crossword puzzle nut.
Yeah, that's right.
And the editors hated to edit them too. They hated to go over this thing to find those mistakes that the artist made. I didn't last long enough before, unfortunately. They had other fish to fry. They hadn't brought me on for that anyway. I learned later. The election was coming up, and I'd done a lot of portrait stuff, you know, the pebble board portraits.
Oh, yes, the Coquille board, they call it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for the dispatch, so a lot of these things that the guy had sent on from Chicago, Brophy, were that kind of thing, because I did some every week. Hardly a week passed that I didn't do a sports drawing or theatrical drawing. Not always on assignment. Sometimes I'd ask for it to do it in Columbus, because I knew that this is where you build a sample pack. So this is one of the things that the guy had said on here. So I did all the candidates. I don't know whether we talked about this last week or not. All the candidates in both parties, 16 candidates for each party. So 30. My first big assignment was 32 portraits of these clowns.
Clowns.
But they made very good portraits.
Sure.
Used the photograph. And fortunately, with the art department, that is the photographic part of the art department, I could get small heads blown up large enough that I could trace them on the Coquille board. I didn't have to pantograph them up, which is a big convenience, of course. And some of these old birds lent themselves to this sort of thing very well. They were craggy-faced. And, surprisingly, the two people who were to finally win the nominations were the hardest to draw with. They were so their faces were so bland by comparison. It was Hoover and Roosevelt. And the two worst portraits that I did out of the whole batch were Hoover and Roosevelt. And of course, they're the ones that
you had to use all over the place.
Yeah. But each AP paper, of course, had this pack of 16 for each party. And during the course of the campaign prior to nomination, almost every paper used almost every drawing because it was a nice two-column, fat, easy fill-in for them. And if they had a printing problem where the halftone was bad reproduction, they always could get a good shot at the letterpress. Anyway, it was a great break-in for me because I did it too fast for them. I was much working on a daily newspaper. You just learn to be fast with this kind of stuff. I think I told you that the other guy said, "Lay off, cool it, kid. We got a good thing going here. Don't spoil it. Grinding this stuff out so fast." Most of them had come from individual newspapers too, so
I see.
they knew exactly
well,
what I was doing wrong.
Yeah.
So you catch on very quickly. Now, about the second. Well, I called Bill Dwyer, who had also worked on the Columbus newspaper.
Oh, he did Girls.
Dumb Dora.
Dumb Dora, that was it.
Yeah, this
Girls
is why
Strip.
it's pertinent here. I called him just socially to say I was in town and say hello. I didn't even know where he lived on Christopher Street. I didn't know where Christopher Street was. So he said, "My God, I'm glad you called. I've got a problem here. Come on down." This is like the first night I was in town. And he had just, he had been submitting things to King Features and the others as well, and selling, by the way, to the magazines. He sold to Collier's and New Yorker and gag stuff. But he had submitted a gag-type strip to the King Features and got a call back saying that Paul Fung was being pulled off of Dumb Dora, and he had the assignment. But here he was suddenly with 6 strips and a Sunday page to do it. He had never done anything except single panels.
Oh, boy.
And he was in trouble. So he, at that time, was living with Frank Engli. They had a studio together.
Frank Engli, E-N-G-L-I, yeah.
So Frank would have been doing his
sports
lettering.
cartoonist, too.
No, he was just a lettering man.
Lettering man.
And he did later on did a little strip called Looking Back about Stone Age characters.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Very well done, cartoony.
Yeah.
But his lettering was good for comic strip lettering especially. So I went down to see them, and they were laboring away on this first release. Bill was a good gag man, very good gag man, but he had never had this kind of assignment before. So he said, "Will you sit in on this thing, especially draw the girls?" I said, "I can't draw girls." And so I laid out the first batch of stuff. And again, it was not hard for me to do because
Yeah,
Used to
yeah.
that 11 o'clock deadlines every morning. And then I inked the girls, and he inked the other characters. A very simple drawing, following.
Who wrote the
follow-
stuff? He did?
He wrote
the stuff.
He was very good, Greg. And Chick Young had originated the character. Then Paul finally had taken over from Chick when Chick started Blondie. And now Paul was drawing from it. I never did find out, by the way, why he withdrew, because I thought it was a pretty good little deal.
Down Dora was a very successful
Mhm.
strip
Ran
in
the
its
journal.
day. Yeah.
Anyhow, maybe they had a fight. Maybe he had a fight with King Features. I never asked because it was none of my business. So we made the deadline, which was the thing was bothering Dwyer. But in the meantime, I had to go to work the next morning. 9 o'clock, 8 o'clock, whatever it was. 9 o'clock, I guess. So for the first weeks of this thing, I was working for him every night, moonlighting down there, doing my regular job during the day. I mean, a hell of a time staying awake
Oh
sometimes.
boy, that's a hell of a schedule.
But again, when you're 25 years old, you can do
Yeah,
this thing.
yeah.
And at that time, my wife hadn't come on yet, so I had nothing else to do. I didn't have to worry about the fact she hadn't been out of the house, hadn't seen a movie, you know. You know the dialogue.
Yeah.
She was still in Columbus closing up our things out there, trying to find some way to pay the rent we hadn't paid out there, but trying to pay the rent here. And so right off the bat, I was into this moonlighting thing, and it was necessary financially because I was only getting $60 a week from the AP, and you couldn't, in those days, even couldn't make it on $60 a week, living in Tudor City, by the way.
Well, it was, yeah.
Now, about not a year from that time, Wilson Hicks had taken over as the head of the AP feature service, and he came around and said, "You know somebody who can do this general assignment illustration?" And I said, "I sure do." Boy, it was Sickles. He was back there doing movie ads for RKO in Cincinnati, hating every minute of it. So I had his work. I didn't have to even send for it. I already had it. Boy, here it is. And of course, they looked at it and said, "Jesus." I'm sure they said, "This will cost us." But he didn't know any more about New York than I had known, and they got him for peanuts, too. He was glad to leave.
What year was this, Mel?
This was in the fall of, spring, actually, of 1933.
I see.
I
Well,
came
it
on in
was
32.
just at the tail end of the Big Depression.
It wasn't even over.
Well, it wasn't over yet, no. Matter of fact, it really hit in 31, 32, I know.
Well, we caught it late in Columbus and the Midwest. We knew all about what had happened, and friends of ours who had Eastern interests in stocks and so forth were hit. But at that age, generally, you don't move in those circles. My mother and dad then lost everything they had in Dayton, but it was a year later.
Yeah,
Almost
that's right. I
exactly
know,
a year
because
later.
I was selling papers downtown in 31.
Exactly. Well, my dad and I lost our jobs the same day. I got fired at the Dispatch the day he got fired at he worked at that time for an automobile company. He was a printer by trade.
Oh, yes? Oh, so you had a little of that ink in your blood.
Oh,
eh?
very definitely.
What about Sickles now?
Well, now
That's
Sickles
an
worked
interesting
already.
development.
He was better in high school than anybody in Columbus or Cincinnati or Cleveland, which is our world at that time. He could do the very work we were doing because he had practiced doing it, making photo layouts, retouching. He'd taken the Landon course, and Landon used to touch on this kind of thing. He really trained you to be a newspaper art department.
It was a Landon art course. I don't remember that now.
C.N. Landon was his name. Charles
Yeah,
N.
that's
Landon.
right. Now I remember.
Draw Me.
Draw Me,
Uncle
yeah,
Sam.
yeah.
Not the Milwaukee outfit.
No, I know. I
It was
remember
Uncle
that.
Sam, the one I used when I applied for the course, and was accepted immediately. Nobody was ever turned down, unless you were under 15. That was one rule he had. It was 15 years old was the limit. I think the reason for it was that below that you couldn't get financial responsibility. Naturally, usually it was your father or your uncle.
Well,
Joe or
also signing an agreement.
that too. Well, under 15, a kid is not responsible. He's not going to continue.
That's right.
He's not going to, with rare exceptions. I took it to when I was about 16, I guess, or so. I never finished it. Nobody ever did, because I got a job.
That's right.
Who needed it? Him.
I love that. Okay.
I got
Great.
a job as an office boy in the
Great.
Dayton Journal Art Department. I got to know Landon later, but by the time I got to New York, he had come to New York as art editor of Cosmopolitan. So I went around to see him with my hat in my hand, just as I would have never met him before, only correspondence. But I showed him things that I had been doing for the AP here, and he said, Well, and he took out his pencil. I was rather easy.
He started criticizing.
He already had read. But he was trying to show me. He was always right, by the way. He was absolutely great at this stuff. He could teach you to draw for the worst reproduction in the world. If they were doing chalk plates, it would come out good.
Oh, that's
he just
marvelous.
Had that skill.
That's marvelous.
He'd touch it not to put crosshatch too tightly together.
Yeah,
and leave it
yeah,
open
that's
so it
right.
reduced and all that stuff. And they're very valuable.
Oh,
to use
that's
single lines with this crayon stuff on that croquis. I'd already done
Yes.
these portraits. And he said, you should always remember that a single stroke of a crayon is better than just mushing around with it, because it leaves some air in there for reduction. And
very
so
good,
all-
sure. Not enough in this generation. Most artists that cartoonists that I see a lot, really are very casual about reproduction. You know, they don't
I
worry
should
about
learn
it.
that first.
Oh,
An old engraver in the Dayton Journal said, "I'll teach you engraving. And you'll make a better living at it than being a dumb art department clown." And I thought about this quite seriously, because I could have done this at night, and those guys were making a lot more money than
Sure,
the art
that's right, they
department,
were.
the union scale, even then.
Yeah, they
This was 1921 or 22, and I told him I was very grateful, but I couldn't. I had to go to school, and I just didn't have the time to do both these things. But along the way, he let me listen in. He would talk. He liked to talk, and he would tell me, this is something you shouldn't do here. He was, every now and then they'd give me an assignment to do on the paper, and he taught me how to not do things more than how to.
How to? Yeah.
The old business of don't let your brush ink gray out. Always
Yeah.
black, so we can pick it up in full
Yeah,
engraving.
that's right.
The old boy would show me, and
That's
how when you're putting, don't isolate something in the middle of a white space. Don't put just a blob of something without some connection. So when we route this thing out, and he showed me with the actual routing machine, it gives us something to hang on to here, so the plate will hold together.
Isn't that valuable?
Oh,
My early career, I spent right after high school. I spent some time working in a print shop, cleaning presses for $3 an hour, $3 a week. I'm sorry, not $3 an hour, but $3 a week. And I consider that one of the most valuable experiences I had. I could sit there with a typesetter, and he'd tell me, the hand compositor, the big fat guy who would make a stick of type, you know.
Yeah.
And I learned about engraving and printing, and it has been useful to me, and as it has to you.
Oh, indeed it has. And my dad gave me some of the stuff, but at the time my dad was actively carrying a stick around in the little bag that they...
Yes, yeah.
And I have all that, brother. I
You
have
still
all
have
his
that old
equipment.
apron? That
And my dad's apron, and it also
Yeah.
his stick. But by the time I got old enough to be able to really assimilate this stuff, my dad had become ill with lead poisoning, by the way, the miserable conditions that they worked
Oh,
under.
sure. All that
And-
type was lead. It wasn't really zinc.
No, and that's what they call it. It has a more fancy name. It's a very bad thing. It leads to tuberculosis. Anyway, his doctors told him he had to get outside. So he got a job out of doors, and that was the end of my contact with the print shop per se. But my contact with the people still remained. It still does to this day. I was named after the editor of my dad's newspaper, Milton. His name
Is
Milton,
that right?
Milton Wedding, German name.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
What town in Ohio is it?
Hillsborough.
Hillsborough. Near, how far
It's
is it from a major city?
It's between Cincinnati and Columbus.
I
about
see.
Halfway
I see. In that
on a
area.
direct line. And a little then weekly newspaper, now daily, by the way. Although the population hasn't altered that much, the advertising has. They got supermarket advertising now, and that makes it possible for
Well,
them.
that's something I'd like to touch on with you later about the role of the newspaper, because it impacts on comic
indeed, it
strips
does.
versus
It
comic
sure
books.
does.
But let me finish off with the Sickles thing, because you left me hanging on
Well,
Sickles.
that's right. Sickles came along.
Sickles came along. He came in from Ohio too, didn't
He
he?
was working in Cincinnati at this point.
Cincinnati,
He and
yeah.
I had tried to start a studio when both of us were fired. He was fired from the Ohio State Journal, and I was fired from the Columbus Dispatch. So we set up a studio in which I would go out and sell during the morning, and he would stay inside, and I would come back in the afternoon, and we would both work on whatever I had sold in the morning. And our big thing was to deliver you a finished rough the next morning. This is what we were trying to beat the engraving shops and very few art studios as such. And we had friends enough among the art directors around Frigidaire and General Motors and big companies like that. We had entree there, and right off the bat we got some good assignments. But it nearly killed us trying to do this thing that we'd set out to do, which is deliver a finished rough tomorrow morning. We'd put it on a bus to go to Cincinnati from Columbus, so to be there by noon, for instance.
Gee,
And,
wow.
It was great, except we couldn't
Keep it up,
we
yeah.
couldn't keep it up. Well, anyway, we were doing very well. We made a good impression. We made a good initial contact and impact, I should say. And then I got this wire from the Associated Press in New York, and I had to decide whether to stay with the advertising thing, this infant that we were working on, or take the AP job. And we talked it over, of course, and Sickles said that the chance to go to New York was worth everything, so go ahead and don't worry about our little deal back there. We got some free space in an advertising agency, so we didn't owe anybody anything. Our billings were still coming in, so we had some money coming. Thank goodness, or we wouldn't have been able to do anything. And Sickles then was able to go on freelance on his own, stayed with the same agency. And again, didn't pay any rent. They didn't pay him, but he was there. It looked good when a client would come in that they had an artist working. And it was really just an exchange of space for a body. And then he would take jobs from them because they had jobs. The trouble is they didn't have that many jobs. Poor guys. Anyway, we stayed warm friends until the man died, the owner of the agency. Now, meanwhile, I was stockpiling Sickles' past and present work, and he went on down to RKO in Cincinnati to do their daily newspaper ads, which was a full-time job in itself. They had several theaters, and he hated every moment of it. Sickles was a good lettering man, among other things. These were beautiful ads, more than they deserved, really. They didn't pay him enough. Nobody ever pays you enough.
That's so true.
Anyhow, he was ready to come to New York, and he was single, so he didn't have to ask anybody anything. He just got on the train and came. When I called him, I told him that this was in the works and be on the alert for a call, because he had to negotiate his own deal. I was not about to act as his agent or something like that. None of my business anyway. I mean, up to him. He knew how much I was getting, and it was up to him to make his own mark. So I imagine he settled for the same amount. I don't even remember now, but he got into much more later when he started doing a feature. But he could live on $60 a week in New York. I couldn't. That's why I had to move. Anyhow, he came on, and of course the AP was so delighted to get him because he could do anything. He was a better general artist than anybody in the place. He could have taken over making maps of the European war or whatever was going on at the time. He was an expert map man, an expert letterer.
Remarkable.
He could do anything. So they, poor old John Terry was doing the strip based on Lindbergh. Didn't look much like Lindbergh because poor old Terry couldn't draw for beans, but the impact was there, and so it sold like crazy all over the place. But the AP method of selling was that they sold the whole service, not the individual strip, in rare instances. But they handed Sickles this assignment and said, "We've got to draw it lousy like John Terry draws it." So he drew it lousy. he could imitate anything.
Well, then, so he took over that. So he got to take over
Scorchy Smith.
Scorchy Smith then at AP.
And he just walked out of the office as far as working in the office, and so they wouldn't bother him with general assignment stuff anymore. He's still in the bullpen, still just working stiff. He'd accepted.
Noel Sickles is he still alive?
Oh, yes. He's doing Western paintings now. He lives in Tucson.
Oh, I see.
But he was still just on an assignment thing in the office, but he was doing this full job of 6 strips a week in that miserable style. But he said he didn't want to hang around the office anymore because every once in a while they'd say, "Oh, this is the crisis in Bolivia or someplace," and draw a map of.
Yeah.
And he said, "The hell with that! You can't do both." And he said,
Sure.
I have to, if I'm going to do this thing, I've got to do it at home and do the research on it and everything, and writing it. He was writing it too. So they said, all right. They didn't want to lose it. They wanted to have him under their thumb, but they didn't want to lose it. So he was living in the Tudor Hotel. In one of those
Oh, yeah.
cubicles.
Well, I had a studio in Tudor City in 1940.
And then he got tired of imitating this thing, but he agreed to do it. And it wasn't fair to poor old Terry not to continue drawing it the way he did. And then Terry died. And then immediately Sickles said, now can I go, Coach? You know? So they said, all right, but gradually. So he gradually shifted to his own style. And of course he drew it like
blazes. Yeah, he's a brilliant
right.
man. Brilliant.
Some of the stuff that he did in that thing.
Yeah.
Used to have
Well,
everything.
he exercised an influence on your style.
Oh,
I guess.
definitely.
Yeah.
Now, at this point, around about this time, I had started to do Dickie Dare. I was still doing the Gay 30s and Dickie Dare, but I had been able to get away from the office. Just about the time Sickles came on there, I was able to take a place over in the YMCA on 47th Street, so I could get away from the apartment and still have a place to work. So he was living in Tudor City, Tudor Hotel. So we said, why the hell don't we join forces again and get a decent place in the Woodstock Tower right next door to the hotel?
Yeah.
And so we rented an apartment there, and it was much better all around, of course. Had your own bathroom and everything else. And Sickles continued to live at the Tudor Hotel, and I lived in the Windsor Tower.
I lived at number 5.
That's the
5.
one I was at.
Yeah.
And lived there right up until we moved to the country in 1937. At that time, the strip had begun to sell.
Yeah.
Things were quite good. Oh, by that time, I'd switched over to Terry, of course. That whole business took place during that time from 1930.
Well, you went to Terry from Dickie Dare?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Patterson saw it in the Sun, the old Sun.
Yeah.
It was shown to him. And then I got a call from, would you like to do a strip for us? And we discussed that before. You remember that he had, the Teeny Weenies were running as a daily strip, daily and Sunday. And
I remember that
I think
feature.
he felt that they were not quite New York News level stuff. And he wanted an adventure strip anyway, a real blood and thunder adventure. So that's why I got the nod, because that's what I was doing with Dickie Dare in the Sun.
Yeah.
And this is what he wanted. A kid, an older guy with the muscles and pretty girls and comedy characters. Straight old
Adventure story. Well, it was in the tradition of Tim Tyler's Luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Which,
it was Tim Tyler, as I remember, was in the flying stuff right from the beginning, wasn't he?
well, Tim Tyler was pretty much like almost like Tintin, Hergé's strip. Tim Tyler would go off on African adventures and so forth. He was a little like, if you remember the books that I grew up on, I'm sure you did too. The Boyle Eyes.
Oh, sure.
The Tom Swift. That
Oh,
whole
I
period.
read them all twice.
Yeah, of course. But those are the books that influence the strips, and that will bring us to a conversation I want to have about that. But I just wanted to get this studio and shop area. But
Well, that's when I first began
Yeah.
to pick Sickles' brains. And this is important in that he was doing the Scorchy Smith his way, and he could knock out those 6 strips in time to make the deadline. That's what influenced my drawing style more than anything else, was being able to do that on a Sunday page in time, because that was always a headache. At that time, of course, we were doing all of our own work. We had no lettering man. And it was at that time also that we decided that between the two of us, let's hire a lettering man. So we went back to Angley, with whom I had worked on Dumb Dora, and called and asked him. He was working for Westinghouse over in New Jersey, still living in the same apartment down on Christopher Street. All this had taken place in a fairly short period of time. I was no longer, of course, associated with Dwyer. He had fired me because I was making too much money, $20 a week. And he thought he could get it done cheaper elsewhere. Fortunately for me, things began to break better for me around that time, so I could make it without the $20. These things always overlap and overmesh.
Yes,
I can't remember which came first, but the with back to England again. Between the two of us, we were able to afford to have him quit his job and come to work. He was glad to. He was sick of the Westinghouse, the job at Westinghouse, I mean, because it was an unusual commercial kind of job, in-house job where he had to do everything imaginable for not enough money, and commute to New Jersey every day. Besides, he used to go over in the tube every day.
Yeah. So you took him on as a letter, and that made a studio.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested in something you just said a moment ago, and that is the picking Sickles' brain. What exactly did you get from Sickles?
Well, first of all, the use of the blacks and the specific shadows and things. I first learned from him that I could do the heavy black shadows with a brush first, and then come back with the pen and do the faces. This was something he was so skilled at that.
See, that really flips me. That takes a hell of a lot of confidence to do a thing like that.
He pencils tighter than I do, and so his compositions and everything, which were exquisite, were all set. And when he could come in there, he didn't work on the faces as much as I did. I went more for character, and he went for general effect.
Yes, I remember that.
And he hated Scorchy Smith anyway, who was a kind of he wasn't a strong enough leading man. He was the Lindbergh thing was fine, except that he was not as assertive as he should have been. So Sickles then was drawing him unassertively. So the secondary characters were better than his main character. He had a couple of bad guys who were marvelous. So often happens, you know. And he had an ex-German fighter pilot who had come to this country. His name was Himmelstoss.
Oh, geez.
And by this time he had a beard, and he was paired off with Scorchy and flying stuff. It was a flying strip on it, of course, with the Lindbergh thing. And he had a ball of that stuff. Whenever it came to that, he was happy with it. But he tried every technique imaginable. He used Ben-Day paper, and he used the chemical Ben-Day paper.
Oh, yeah, the crafty.
He used crayon. He used everything in the book, and it was all great. And as soon as he had licked it, he lost interest.
Yeah.
So he was so bored with that thing that finally he said, "The hell with it." And so by that time they'd been suspecting that this might happen at the AP. So they had what the hell was his name? Frank. Very good.
Oh, yes, I remember.
Went to King Features later.
Yeah.
They
Robbins?
Had him,
Frank Robbins.
They had him warming
he
up at the
took
bullpen.
Yeah.
So Sickles then started doing editorial cartoons for the AP. And if Scorchy Smith was insipid, you can imagine the AP's editorial cartoons.
Yeah.
He could never say anything.
No, that's right, because they had so many newspapers, they didn't want to offend anybody.
He couldn't even say Hitler was a bad guy. You could just show what Hitler was doing and let the reader make up his mind about it. But you could never say anything.
Yeah.
And Sickles had fun with this for a while, and then after a time, just this milquetoast business began to bore him.
Yeah.
So he quit.
Yeah. Well, he's a courageous man. Well, getting back to the technology or the art style, so really what you picked up in working with Sickles is the business of being able to lay black in on a figure and then outline.
And in time. The big thing always was time. He could do it fast and good.
Yeah.
With me, it took a while for me to get the hang of it. And when I finally did, it was in the nick of time, because this is right about the time where I was tapering off on Dickie Dare and starting Terry.
I see. So
For
really
the first
needed
few
the
months
speed.
of Terry was more or less the old style, because I was scared to jump in the deep end of the pool.
You were using a pen then, pretty much the way you are today.
Yeah. And afterward, when I began to get more adept with the brush, then I finally started. Fortunately, the background of things in China at that time, the war was imminent. So it could do a lot of military stuff, and it always lends itself to heavy blacks.
Yeah, yes, I would imagine.
Explosions.
Yeah.
And things being blown up in the water.
Yeah, that kind of thing. Also, you had a lot more space to work in those days than you have today.
I was working in tabloid size then, in the tabloid configuration. Now I work on the the 8 columns wide, 3rd page deep configuration, just simply because, again, the greatest number of clients.
Yeah.
Let the rescale come as it will.
Well, let me. All right. I don't want to lose some conversation that I think will be very valuable. Are you comfortable?
Yeah.
Are you all right?
Mm-hmm.
They usually serve coffee here about this time, but I guess today they're not doing it. I want to get back. Let's start talking a little bit about the business we're in. Let me set up a couple of postulate, and you can beat the hell out of it. I think that I have been saying for some time, I have been regarding, as a matter of fact, that this whole medium is a kind of an art form. Now, as we talked the other day, you must remember that I really grew up in comic books. My newspaper experience was really as a comic book artist. As a matter of fact, when you first met me was when the National Cartoonist Society started.
Yes.
That first meeting was being formed, and I was kind of I was a token comic book artist because there was nobody else in the society at the time that was a comic book artist. They were all big time. You were the hierarchy then.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yes.
you were the aristocracy, and us we were the. But so that I was thinking in terms differently than you fellows were, because I remember standing around as a beardless youth listening to you real old pros. You guys seem old to me then. And you were talking about circulation. You had a relationship with circulation far greater than we did in comic books.
Yes.
Because comic books, we never knew how many copies actually sold, because our salaries and our fees were not predicated on how well it sold, simply how much the publisher liked us or how well he thought we did.
And he wouldn't tell you anyway. Of course.
No, of course.
He didn't want you to ask for a raise.
Well, what I'm getting at, Milt, in this long opening is to point out that since I have always regarded this, rather taken this art form seriously, as an art form, apropos of the literature I just gave you, how did you and your contemporaries see yourselves as comic artists? Because you were there first.
Well, the art form, yes, but not in so many words. We were, I think, first of all, a circulation device. I had an editor once who said, remember always that the old man pays for the paper, and draw for the old man who pays for the paper. This is in the 20s. Because if the old man doesn't bring the paper home, it won't be read in the house. At the same time, you must remember that sometimes in home-delivered circulation, the lady of the house will decide which newspaper. In that day, there was a choice, very often multiple choice, of which paper do you subscribe to or have delivered to your house. And very often the old man would read the paper on his way to the office if it was a transportation situation where he went on a bus or a subway or that big city kind of thing where there was time to read, and the wife of the house would be having a second cup of coffee or in the bathroom or wherever. There was a moment in which you had your little tete-a-tete. Now that hardly exists even today. The newspaper delivery, home delivery still exists, but the reading it on the bus is almost gone because most men drive to work anyway, no matter where they go, or they go to carpool in the big industrial cities. So generally speaking, it's read at home now. Now, same editor said, you got to remember that you're not selling today's paper. They've already got today's paper. You're selling tomorrow's paper. Now he's talking generally now about anything in the newspaper, but he said, the cliffhanger, you cliffhanger boys, already my bent was toward that kind of thing. Have a better chance to do this than a gag a day people, where if somebody likes to read Blondie, they'll just read it tomorrow because they want to see again if the postman gets knocked down by Dagwood racing out of the house to go to the office. But with the cliffhangers, you are selling tomorrow's paper, and that's why at that time we were on the ascendancy. The Dick Tracy's and the Orphan Annie's and subsequent.
Well, did you regard yourselves as newsboys, that is, newspaper salesmen, or did you regard yourselves as people involved in some kind of an art form, entertainers? Did you think of yourself as
Entertaining,
entertainer?
first of all, he always
So
said
I know
this,
Rube Goldberg used to refer to himself, whenever I heard him
Yeah.
chat in private conversation, think of himself as a kind of an entertainer.
well, this editor's contention, and I think I learned more from that one editor than I ever did from any other single editor. His point was that with entertaining, you must be entertaining, no matter what you do, what you say, whether you make it have a message, whether you're just showing off your skill. If you're not entertaining or causing pleasure in the reader's eye, then you're failing your mission, because the newspaper itself is an entertainment medium. You read the news headlines, but almost from there on, you're reading for entertainment, maybe sports scores, but in the meantime, you read about the sports as entertainment. You're enjoying reading about Babe Ruth hitting the home run or whatever, it was that era. And he said, always remember back to the man who pays for the paper, no matter who reads it at home, essentially it's the man who pays for the paper. And he said, always show a little skin above the stocking for the old man as a bonus. And he was right.
That's right. Yeah.
I never forgot that. Of course, you had to be judicious as hell about the
Sure.
way you showed that
Yeah.
skin above the stocking. And I found, just as the movies have been finding out, that it's much more provocative to the promise of, rather than the realization
of course.
Man's
of
reach
course.
must exceed his grasp. and so on.
Exactly. But at any rate, what I'm probing is the question of how you people saw yourselves, because over across the street or down in the in a valley where us comic book artists were working, most of them saw themselves really as drones, as drudges working in I always compared a comic book shop to a large galley. Everybody on oars, pulling oars.
Right. Well, sometimes we like that too.
And occasionally, a character like me would come along and think that he, rather presumptuously, that he's in some kind of an art form, and walk around thinking that's what he's doing is literature. But when I got to talking to the strip artists, that is the newspaper side of this business, the newspaper artists, writers like yourself, the cartoonists, regarded themselves, I thought, as entertainers,
Yeah.
and in show business, if you will. In fact, didn't Rube Goldberg do a lot of vaudeville acts for a long time?
Oh, he did. He had a one. I forgot what he called it now, but he just drew pictures and talked, chalk talk.
Yes, they were chalk
in
talk.
one,
Yeah,
as they say.
yeah.
Just a spotlight in the drawing board.
Yes,
and drew
yes,
it. And,
yes.
he did it on
He
big
was
time.
very
He
funny.
did it,
Yeah, I remember seeing him in the RKO Palace.
Yes.
He did a stint.
Yeah,
I recall.
and quite successful. He would have probably traveled more, except that he still had to grind out a regular stuff every day
Yeah,
at that time.
yeah.
And he was being very highly paid. One of the incentive things in the strip field is that you were being paid on a percentage basis with circulation. You had this intense, well, you had the big chance to make as much money as you could make, just on the same simple syndication level.
Yeah.
So that always it was like a performer in theater and movies, who, if one picture was successful, would get more money from the next picture.
Yeah.
Very seldom has anybody ever bettered their percentage level, but people did. It happened every once in a while, so that you go from 50-50 to 70-30 or 60-40 or whatever you could.
Do you know, Milt, of any of your contemporaries who would admit that what they were doing was art?
I don't think that it ever was quite put on that basis, but it was certainly put on the basis of the fact that it was a form. It was a communications form rather than an art form, I think.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I ever heard anybody use the phrase art form as such. It started out being a job which could be improved, but always, again, it was a rent payer to start with.
Uh-huh.
And then as it improved, it became a better and better rent payer, but still you were married to a simple business of making a living.
You
Always
did you think of yourselves as being on the same level as, let's say, or as a a writer, a fiction writer, let's say?
Yes, I think without
they-
ever having expressed it so.
Did you all think that way?
Mhm.
Yeah.
We were shooting in a sense for the mass audience and a provable mass audience. This is one break that the syndicate people always got, was that when your syndication list went up, it meant that you were getting more and more readership, and as well as more and more income, so that you began to feel more important as a result of this, and for good reason, because you could prove it.
Yeah.
The difference between a guy who's hired as an executive on an employment contract is quite different from a guy who signs a contract because, renews a contract because he's built up 600 papers or whatever, and he doesn't have to argue the point. There it is.
Yeah.
It's there because he did it. And this is the greatest break we've ever had. It works the other way, too. If you start losing papers, of course, But the president of General Motors can't prove anything. Just how many cars were sold was not either his fault or his
That's right. That's
failure.
right. There's a lot of things. You know.
So he's on a shop rights contract. He can't even invent. The guy down in the interior of General Motors who works out a new gear or something, a new tool.
But in the main, then, your satisfaction or your self-measurement, if I can make a word like that, came from the amount of papers you sold and the buildup of your circulation and so forth and so on. This was the main to let this run a few feet in order for us to get some conversation. But just to refresh what we were talking about, I was really trying to get at how we see ourselves, because things have changed. Candidly, I now have been operating rather under the last 10 years anyway, devoting myself to the theory that what I have here is a medium which is capable of far more than what has been done so far. Well,
I agree with that. I think it hasn't even been plumbed. We've been doing the best we can, but timorously. Once in a while I will do something that I was told not to do, and bend the rules. I'll give you, for instance, when I went to the news to do Terry and the Pirates, I had not been doing a Sunday page, so they had no track record of me in a Sunday page in color. So Joe Patterson himself said, "This is fast printing, of course, and we have to keep it simple." And he said, Jiggs always wears a red vest, and so-and-so has a plain, flat blue. And he said, "He's only got 3 colors to work with." He prided himself on his really very real knowledge of the mechanics of the business, as well as the less easily identified skills. And he said, "Well, keep your colors simple." I thought, "I'm not going to do this." I said, "They've got the best newspaper engravers on this paper, and in Chicago they always make 2 sets of plates on Terry and all the others. The half-page size standard was made in Chicago, while the tabloid was being made in New York, and that's all they offered in the beginning. You couldn't get these 3/4 pages or in-between stuff. And they were very arbitrary about it. He said, "If the paper's out on the circuit, don't like it, tell them to lump it." He didn't give a damn about anything except the New York News and the Chicago Tribune.
Oh, gosh.
So
those were the key papers.
German engravers.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought, God, I never had such a chance as this in my life to do color beyond anything, to really paint a picture with a color scheme indication, color chart, whatever they call it. And I'm just going to do it. And so right from the start, I started using the most elaborate color schemes that I could get. And these engravers were challenged for the first time, some of them in a long time, and they really came through. Well, gradually, Patterson himself began to like this. He didn't say he did, but he did, and I heard through the grapevine. And finally, they took one of those old German engravers at the news and put him on Terry on that tabloid page. All week, he didn't do anything else.
How about that? That's fascinating.
Because, and I learned all this through the grapevine, of course, but Patterson has ordered this himself. He loved this stuff, all of the background. Boy, you could do a sunrise, and they took those engravings.
Well, they were dot etching in those days,
Oh,
you know.
yeah,
If you remember that. Hang on a minute, I see if I can.
He killed that.
But
He would have killed my dad. He would have just left over that because he was on that side of the business, you know. And any use of the material or
Well,
tools.
terminology, yeah. Yeah.
He would have appreciated that very much indeed.
Well, the tools of the trade, like we said earlier, it was so important to know what's going to happen to your work ethic. Well, let's get back to the question of the art form and where comics are going, because I think this really is the most important thing. In what we're living through now is what Dickens called the best of times and the worst of times. The syndicate business seems to be drying up under the face of most of us who are in the adventure continuity. How do you see it at this time?
Well, the adventure story as such, and whatever form it takes before it gets into production, as films or on a newspaper or on hard paper, soft paper, any other thing, is going to remain. Everybody will like to know what's going to happen next, whether it's tomorrow or the next page or whatever. And I've always gone on the pretext that, not a pretext at all, but on the simple thesis that anything that can make the reader, viewer, listener, or whatever, want to turn the page. And turn the page may be tomorrow's issue of something, or it may be next week's MASH or whatever. These guys are all doing the same, making the same proposition for the same reasons, to hold you one way or another. The gag men have a harder time, but that's not the point now. As far as where it's going, it's a matter of how it's going to be produced. The cable television, for instance, is going to change the whole aspect of syndicates, syndicate contracts, everything else. Is this ability to put it in your house or before your eyes or ears or whatever, in another form than the form that we've been doing it. Get it down now to the point where the postage stamp is too much for the older reader. Older readers can't even read the damn stuff. Well, it's going to topple. They save space and then lost readers. This is going to topple, but it'll topple in some other form. It'll take a form which will communicate itself to the listener, viewer, consumer, or whatever. Unfortunately, none of us know what that form will be. But along the way, it has not lost its steam. For instance, there are more clients now for Prince Valiant than ever existed before.
Is that a fact?
I was surprised because it isn't in New York, it isn't in Chicago, but the other papers around the country and overseas as well have raised that list to higher than when Hal Custer was doing.
Well, no, that's a Sunday paper only. It's only a Sunday feature.
Yeah, but the point is that all the Sunday papers folding and
yes,
and
that's astonishing.
Cries of horror that you hear.
Yeah, that's astonishing.
I heard this from Ben Schwery at King Features, so it's right from the horse's mouth.
Incredible.
And at the same time that they're crying havoc about every other feature, Charlie Schultz is making more money than anybody ever has made. He's the highest paid person in the United States.
Incredible.
And
Walker.
Mort Walker has 3 strips and is going to start another one. You don't do this on a dying. This is no Titanic that we're working in.
Well, they're daily. They're humor strips, essentially.
Well, in that instance, yes, but it still is what happens to Beetle Bailey tomorrow. This is what causes you to continue. You laugh today, but still.
You want to see what he's going to do again tomorrow.
You want to see more of him.
Well, is it that are the newspapers proliferating, or is it the use of
shrinking?
They're shrinking. So how is it possible if these strips are?
Well, here's the way it's going, and this is the simplest kind of economics. When the Chicago Tribune used to protect, as they said, all the territory around Chicago. You couldn't buy Terry and the Pirates in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, or Wisconsin. When I started Steve Canyon, every paper in the daily-sized cities all around there, with a very tight little skein around Chicago, were available as customers, and suddenly, boom, I had papers in Indianapolis and Iowa City and Milwaukee, which I didn't have before with Terry. And so that has happened in that regard. Now, the neighborhood papers are the ones that have done it. When I was living in Rockland County, for instance, the Rockland Journal News was a good little country paper, daily, but still a country paper. Now it's a big metropolitan-sized thing, and that's where the business is. across the river in Croton, Peaksville. They're metropolitan-sized newspapers in all of those cities. And you open them up, and here is Hagar the Horrible, and all of these papers that are now up to 2,000. I think Hagar's a 1,900 papers or something like that.
1,900 papers,
which is
incredible.
really saturation. You can't get any tighter than that. Peanuts may be a little larger because he has been around longer and he has more foreign papers.
Yeah, Blondie is supposed to have had the largest.
Blondie still has the largest circulation because it's widely read and has been widely read for a long time for all the wrong reasons. That is, in South America, they think it's funny. They think it's ridiculous, ludicrous that a woman could dominate her husband like that. And that's why they read it in the Latin. The opposite. Well, Hagar is funny because Hagar is funny. And Schultz's thing is so universal, translating this, little kids are little kids in any country. Translation is easy. And then there's a third one, which is the third one. Let's see. Hagar.
Well, a beetle, really?
Beetle is the third. There are four. King has three of them. And United, of course, has
incredible.
They're the saturation.
Incredible.
Four.
Wow. Incredible.
They can't go anywhere. They can't even sell anybody because there ain't nobody left to sell.
Isn't that wonderful?
Of course, well, this is not falling down depression. This is very big stuff. And Mort's coming up with another news.
Well, he's an industry. Three. I think he's the first individual multimedia, multinational conglomerate. I think he's a one-man conglomerate.
He calls his studio King Features East. He's out there on the island,
up
Connecticut.
Connecticut, No, he's a one-man conglomerate. He's got 4 strips, and all of them are good.
Oh, they're good indeed.
I think he's a genius. This kind of
some of the things that he does, of course, are more appealing. His High and Lois is appealing for the obvious reason of the suburban life, which he does as well. He's a hell of a gag man to start with. He's also a very disciplined person, and he doesn't even appear to sweat. And here he's coming out with a new one. He has one called Boner's Ark, which we don't see around here, and one called Salmon Silo, which is
I've seen that.
They're comedy things, all of them are gags. I don't know what the new one is.
Well, we're talking again about the future, where this is all going. Do you think that, in other words, the newspaper business is going to be around for some time, and daily strips will be around for some time in whatever form they take? Is that what you think?
Let me play you back something. You'll see what I mean about the changing device, or the medium, the idiom rather than not the medium. Back before the war, just before the war, I think it was NBC was playing around with a device like a ticker tape where you could get your whole newspaper in the morning, but it came on the floor in loops like ticker tape. And so they used the Columbus Dispatch as a testing ground for this, and they reduced the whole thing down so that when you received it on your machine, it was like coming out of a typewriter or a copying machine, about that wide, like legal size, legal width. And it was the whole page, but a completely legible thing on a facsimile basis. And the comic strips were right there, reduced slightly. As of that day, we were being reproduced to at least 5 or 6 columns in 1939. That's when this happened. And the reason I got it was that a friend of mine was on the Dispatch and sent it to me. They did this experimenting out in Ohio. And then the war came, and they had to stop all this stuff down. Now, we'll probably be going back to something similar to that, and this is 40 years ago. Something similar to that, of having a newspaper in your house, and perfectly legible, and you tore off Mama wanted the food section, you just
tear it off.
Tore it off the machine, actually, almost literally. Except that the paper would be there on the floor.
Like a UP ticker that.
Except it was silent, and would come in during the night, or some form of it that. As of 1939, the reproduction was good, but not the quality you'd get today.
When I was running, for a while, I was head of Bell McClure, as you probably remember or know. I was president of Bell McClure, North American newspaper in Nana. You remember both those old-timey features. It was a short career, but a very intensive one at the time. And we were approached at that time on the possibility of a facsimile thing, which would go out as a total service with
Mhm.
art and so forth. And I was trying to, since I was cartoon-oriented, art-oriented, I was trying to. But there were a lot of impracticalities
Oh,
about
sure.
it.
Yeah,
At
all-
that time, this was in 1955, early 60s.
Well, the most legible thing about this 1939 effort, because it was small enough, that the type was pretty tight and the reproduction wasn't that good, but the strips are perfect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Moon Mullins and the Winnie Winkle or whatever was.
So in other words, you see the daily strip potential as being still very much there.
Very much there, and if anything, more explosive than before, because people will find a niche. In other words, the television took our immediate audience away because they could do it in a half hour, which took 10 weeks to do.
Mm-hmm.
So there was no comparison. I had editors saying, "Why don't you speed up your continuity? Let us make it 8 weeks instead of 10." I said, that would make any difference, you know?
Yeah.
I thought, Jesus, this guy's editing a metropolitan newspaper, and his reasoning would be so short-sighted as that. Why should he knows I can't do this if I'm going to try to compete with television. I'm not going to make it. She said, you can't. You've got to find a whole other audience.
Exactly, yeah.
Time. For one thing, it's a person-to-person medium. Television is usually a shared thing. You seldom watch television by yourself. You're almost always with somebody, either in your home or at the club or at the bar or wherever you are. But you read your newspaper alone, almost without exception. In fact, you want to be alone when you read it. You don't want somebody yakking in your ear. And in time, this personalization, I think, will be the, not salvation of our kind of viewed image thing. It'll be just simply a continuation of it, a new format of the old thesis. Again, selling tomorrow's ticker tape or whatever the device is, which will again change by the next year. This has changed since last year.
Well, tell me, as a adventure cartoonist, which is what the category adventure series, do you find in talking or hearing in the playback you get from the syndicate, is there any feeling about where adventure strips are going in view of the fact that you've got this view of what television has taken away, so to speak, from newspapers? What have you heard?
Well, of course, nobody has an absolutely locked-in view. They're all almost living day to day like an alcoholic. They'll do anything to live tomorrow. At the same time, they're prospering. This is a thing that King Features pointed out in the Newspaper Comics Council the other day. The advertising has fallen off in the newspaper comics sections. There's secret rejoicing among the cartoonists because that's what stole all the space over there. in the beginning. Patterson rationed advertising as one page, either in a full page or a half page forms, and then gradually had to increase that to a page and a half because the pressure was on. Advertisers during the war years especially were desperate to advertise. They had an audience and people had money, but they couldn't get their ads in the paper because the newspaper was so short. So they turned to the comic sections, and that's how Metro and Puck were born. Now, here we are with these people crying havoc because their ads are going to television again, largely. But the comics, at the same time, and I refer you back to Prince Valiant, are on the rise. King Features has never done better in terms of their income. They've raised their prices, of course, but the strips that are going well are going better than they were going last year. And these suburban papers are the reason for that, because in terms of just volume, there's plain clients, numbers of clients. And they don't have the restrictions now. There's no place in the country where a paper is holding territory like the Chicago Tribune.
Yeah.
Even around Los Angeles, for instance, it used to be 50 miles for the Hearst paper. And it's gradually shrunk to now, just last year, Palm Springs was able to print my strip because it was in their no-no territory.
Oh, I see. It was a forbidden, we call it a given territory. Yeah, territory, that was what they were. And then my salesman used to come back and complain about the fact that they had a lot of peripheral papers. We even tried to organize a regional alliances around Cleveland, the whole ring of papers around Cleveland, trying to pull them out from the big plain dealer who had a lock on the whole area.
Still does to the extent of that is the paper of record. You're going to advertise that you're going to leave your wife's bed and board. That's
Yeah,
the one
that's
you
the
have
place to
advertise.
do it. Yeah. Oh, so they got the sheriff's notices. The court notices.
Yeah.
Well,
All the legals. That's
yeah,
what
the
they
legal
call
notices. That's right. Well, that's an interesting point because to the beginning cartoonists, my students, the syndicate business seems, a bastion into which they can not get. And as they get smaller and smaller, the strips get smaller, the page size. But most of the kids I see are big city people who see only the big
Yes,
city
yes,
papers.
yes.
They're not the ones who see the Rockland County, the Woodstock Dispatch, or whatever the case may be.
But one thing that you must convey to them, first of all, there'll be a way out of this adventure, not so much adventure, but story strips. This could apply to the Heart of Juliet Jones,
Yeah.
strips like that. Any continuity strip is taking the beating. Adventure strips, well, any continuity strip is in hot water now, because when you do get printed, they print you so small that the older reader can't read it. The younger readers will slough it off. But now I'm beginning to get letters from kids again. For a long time that, the older reader now, who are still my readers, are still there. But the young kids, what I lost was a whole generation or so of the middle group, young marrieds, now older marrieds. But the mail from young kids saying, I'd like to be a cartoonist, what
You're
should I
getting
do?
more mail now than
Yeah.
in that one? That's
Mhm.
interesting.
In the last 3-4 years, it just began to gradually expand in volume and intensity. There's hope in the sense that they realize that new strips come along, such as Hagar. Hagar's a good example. Of course, Dick Brown is an old pro. He's not like some kid
Yeah.
going to break in there. But still, it was never there before. All of a sudden, it's there.
Yeah, it's there.
And for that matter, there's no red-hot success except Doonesbury, which is in a whole class by itself.
Well, that's a political
I
cartoon.
can't list that under anything, but it's
Yeah.
also entertainment. Now, this is what editors had to decide whether he was winning the Pulitzer Prize, which he did, because of the political aspects of it. It was still a comic strip, and the important thing about it
Yeah.
is that just because it was not done in a single panel, it was political, but at the same time, it was entertaining, damn sight more entertaining than many of the strips on the comics page. And I think editors who pulled it out of the comics page, put it by itself or on the editorial page, were just ducking the issue. They were. It was up to them to decide, and their decision was a hedge rather than a decision. Now, the Los Angeles Times, for instance, which of course is a bulwark newspaper, they can do what they please, never budged, and they let it stay right where it was. They
On the
didn't-
comics
didn't
page.
hold out. Other editors felt that he was being too specific by having an unmarried man and woman living together. And in another place,
And they felt it didn't belong on the comics page
Yeah.
because that was a family page.
Exactly. And then when they got into
they
the
could-
political stuff, well, LA Times didn't do any of this. And once the girl was being courted by a guy, and he says, I'm gay. And she said, well, I'm good-natured, too. Other papers threw that out. Well, what happened immediately was, for instance, where I lived, the Riverside paper dropped it out, and I read it in the Los Angeles Times, right? Same morning, same day.
Yeah.
And other people did that, too.
Well, there is still that mystique that editors regard the comics page as the family page, and by
Most
God, there's
editors
just
hate
been
the comics.
nothing.
You know,
Yes, I've noticed that even from the first days that I went out with, I used to go out with the syndicate salesman as a kid, and I found that for some reason or other they said, well, we have to have these.
Yeah, and that's the attitude they took. And then very often the choice of strips would be gents room poll, you know. The
Yeah.
guy in the next journal.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah,
read this?
yeah,
Did you
yeah.
see? He would pass proofs around the sitting room, of course. This is no place to take a poll of anything, because the guy's got to vote for what he thinks the boss wants him to vote
Of
for.
course.
Anyway.
As a matter of fact, I've always felt that syndicate cartoonists, newspaper cartoonists, suffered from the kind of surveys, quote, in italics, that they make. They'd go out and say, well, we made a survey, so they'd run a small box in the newspaper of an afternoon and say, which comics do you like most? And those people wrote in all of a sudden, and usually it was Little Orphan Annie. In the days when Orphan Annie, nobody read Orphan Annie except the little old lady. Norman Isaacs once told me that he wanted this was a number of years ago when I was in the syndicate business running around, told me that he was trying to drop Little Orphan Annie, and he said he couldn't because the bulk of his subscription circulation were nice little old ladies in the suburbs, and they would have nothing to. He said he couldn't drop the damn feature.
Yeah, Marvin used to work hard at it. He was a very conscientious editor, and he had his own favorites. But at least he acted as an editor should act. He edited. He'd raise hell with you if you got us.
Yeah. You could hear from him. Well, that was a welcome thing from when I worked. I imagine you.
I loved it.
Because we always seem to be working in a vacuum there.
I'd rather have the guy mad at me than ignore me.
That's right. Yeah. Say something. You know. Do you like it? Well, no. I think that there's in the world of comic books, or in the so-called underground, now ground level, or underground becoming ground level.
Salt.
The reaction is much more immediate. The mail is more immediate, and as I said, there now sales or acceptance is quick. You understand it and hear it. But in the world of comic strips, you don't really know. A newspaper never really knows how popular a given strip is.
They really don't.
I'm glad to hear that, because I have never found any scientific, proper way of testing.
No newspaper has. The closest thing I've seen to a decent survey, at least a fair survey, was taken by the Philadelphia Inquirer, and this is what they did. They broke the comics page up. This is one of those, which ones do you want to keep in the paper, and which one, if you wanted one dropped, which one would you prefer? And then the next thing they did, which was a great break for us, is that they put the adventure strips in one category, and so you're voting only for those strips.
Ah, yes, good.
The funny strips, the panels, the special categories like Doonesbury, and now there are 2 or 3 others one called Bloom County, which is in a way a spin-off of Doonesbury, in that he makes specific political commentary, even about the King, or rather the Prince of Wales and his wife, that kind of stuff, which is dynamite, but great for readership if you can get away with it, if the paper itself can get away with it. You could do this in the cities. Usually it doesn't even make its way into the smaller city dailies anyhow. It would never show up there. But Doonesbury, on the other hand, has had such an impact that it has even penetrated into the smaller cities. And the college towns love it.
Well, that's where it really started, actually.
Yes, really. And then the more noise, the more attention. Not necessarily readership. I'm sure you found this to be true, that Charlie Schultz said that there are a lot of people who don't even know he does a comic strip. All they know is the movies, television, the greeting cards, Snoopy doing his stuff. He said, I get letters from people who say, I just found out that you draw a strip in the newspaper. And it makes him mad, and then he looks at the paycheck, and he's not
doing a lot better, yeah.
Anyhow, this is so often true that people will learn about a thing from the noise it makes elsewhere. An actor, for instance, who will be, you will not have ever seen him in a movie theater, but you know all about the fact that he just divorced his wife.
Yeah. I don't know. People, there's a whole body of that, because our media is so multiplied that we get a bearing on that.
Jack Benny used to talk about that. He said it always makes him mad, but he can't show it when somebody will say, I enjoy your work. You do the great imitation of something. He's talking about Red Skelton.
Yeah.
Actually not familiar with the guy's work at all, but they've heard about Jack Benny. He's a famous guy.
And you ought to know him, yeah.
And he said, well, great. Thank you very much.
Well,
we get that too, of course, as has happened with you. We're obscure in personal terms as people. I used to be called Al Cap. I was even introduced once as Al Cap. And Al and I don't look anything alike or anything else about it, and yet in the mind of the person.
I've been introduced as the artist who creates the saint.
Yeah,
of
course.
What do you say?
You don't say anything. You just say thank you.
Well, Milt, I think it's getting on to time, and I think I've chewed up enough of your time. One of the disappointments of this interview is that we haven't really had an argument. I've been throwing out things that you would say, I disagree with your own wit, but you haven't. And I thank you for it. I think it's wonderful.
Well, one thing about this business, and I'm sure you found it true, And I quote John Wayne on this. He said, people say, I've never heard you say anything nasty about other actors. He said, man, we got enough trouble in this business without fighting each other.
Fighting each other.
Yeah, so you won't hear me talk.
No, well, I don't. There aren't too many people in this business that I'm mad at. Maybe there's something wrong with me, but
Well,
you seem to
not
be the same
necessarily.
way.
We don't see each other. Once Burgess Meredith, Burgess used to drink too much, and I'd have to take him home sometimes, that kind of thing. This is when we lived in the East. But we still see Burgess. He lives in Malibu, or Springs, and so on. And he said, no, we get along fine. And then there's a pause, and he said, we don't see each other very often, do we?
Oh, I see.
And this is often true.
Oh, that's right. All right.